Welcome back to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, and academics and students and activists on topics of higher education, free speech, and other related topics in American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as on any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, Anchor. Wherever you get your podcast, download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you hear today, give us our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. So I'm very excited today to welcome Jorge Andres Galicia to the show. Jorge is a political activist who has been speaking up against the horrors of socialism and the socialist regime of Venezuela since his time in college. And as a student, Jorge has embodied the reasons we care so much about free speech in the United States. So thank you so much for joining the show, Jorge. I would love to hear your story, but I really appreciate you coming on and speaking up, of course.
Thank you, Cherise, for the invitation. It is an honor for me to be here today.
Absolutely. So let's start off with just how you got involved in political advocacy. What prompted you? What kind of initiated this turn for you? Why did you get interested in all of this?
Yes, of course. I think if I remember correctly, the year I became an activist for freedom was approximately in the year 2014. This is the year when I became a law student in Venezuela. And well, the reason I became an activist is because I saw how Venezuela started to become such a nightmare, basically. I used to be part of the Venezuelan middle class. In my house, we used to live like not that differently from any other middle class member here in the US. I mean, we used to have, water supply, electricity. Me and my family used to go to restaurants every once in a while. We used to travel abroad sometimes. I mean, it was a pretty good life. But then in the year 2014, I saw how that reality changed almost completely to the worst. For example, in my house, we stopped having water supply. Electricity started to fail on a daily basis. We lost internet connection for long periods of times. Waste management is basically stopped happening. Wow. I mean, even food started to be something really, really hard to find for us. In the years 2015 and 16, scarcity of food was so bad that in my house we stopped buying beef or chicken or stuff like that because it was either unaffordable for us or extremely hard to find in the marketplace because of all of the scarcity that we saw during those years. So because of that situation that I was seeing in my homeland and that was affecting me and my family, directly, well, I decided to get involved in the fight against the Maduro regime in Venezuela because I knew for a fact that that regime, that socialist regime, was the reason why we were suffering so much in Venezuela, and that's why our life was transformed so dramatically, right? So I saw that nightmare and I said, I need to take action, not only because I love freedom, but because I care about my own personal life. And I read the experience of countries like, Ukraine or the Holodomor and all of these horrible experiences that humanity went through when they were dealing with communism and socialism. And I knew Venezuela was heading directly towards that path. And I decided to take action because it was in my self-interest, right?
Yeah. So before we get into like how what it meant to take action and what that looked like for you, I want to pull on a couple of strings of things you brought up. First of all, you're talking about water and electricity. These are things that Americans this is a given, right? This is not something that we would ever imagine we would be struggling to find somewhere. And obviously you have your occasional blackouts because of severe weather, but this is not something that one day it goes off and never comes back on. And that mentality of having to fight to survive, or just like that shift in gears, right? Like you're going from this like kind of regular lifestyle, what most Americans would say like a regular middle class lifestyle, to just wondering if you actually like started to kind of like your gears are sort of started to turn. Wait a second, I might not actually be able to find water. Like, what was that like? This kind of sudden, like it's just like very sudden, right?
No, it was horrible, and just as you said, Americans here take those things for granted, and I think me and my family did exactly the same mistake when we were in Venezuela. Before the year 2014, we were used to a real different kind of living, you know. We used to have electricity for most of the time, water supply. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but all of those basic services were always there. And you know, you always assume that those things are kind of your environment, are part of your environment. You know, it's like it's like a natural thing to for those things to be there, right? But at the moment you lose it, you know, it can be gone away really quickly if you follow the wrong ideas. And I think I hope Americans don't commit that mistake, because I can say that we did it, and because we commit that mistake, maybe we didn't take action as fast as we should have to avoid this scenario from happening, right? I remember that we have this anecdote in the year 2013, probably something like that. My mom and I saw a homeless guy outside our house, and he was picking up trash to look for something to eat, right? You know, my mom saw this and she felt like pity for this guy. She decided to, you know, she went back to our house and she picked up some food to give it to him. But this guy said something to us incredibly clever that I haven't forgotten until today. He said, like, hey, don't feel bad about me, because I've been homeless for most of my life and I know how to survive. You know, I know I'm more than capable of finding food in the trash can and you know, go day after day like that. But you people are really proud, and I know that because of the politics that we're seeing and where this country is heading, majority of us are going to be in the same scenario as I am right now. But you guys are not gonna be humble enough, or you're not gonna be capable of going to a trash can and start digging for food, because you know you are too proud to do that. And I felt like, wow, that's actually really powerful. I really never thought about that. And well, guess what? A few years later, well, thanks God, I never got into that position that I needed to go to the trash can to eat. But definitely my diet indeed changed a lot. As I said, we stopped buying meat, we stopped buying a lot of different things. And it's interesting to think too, like, because everyone's going to react to that in different ways, of course, right? Depending on what your background is and what your expectations are. But you start to ask the question, you know, we do talk a lot about fighting for our rights in America, right? Like we talk about, but it's interesting because we actually haven't ever had to fight to survive. Our generation, my generation, I'm a millennial. Like we haven't had to fight to survive in that way, to that extent, to where we are like a large percentage of the country, if not all of the country, is starving and dying, and you know, in some sort of disrepair. And that's something that we've never experienced it. And it honestly, you kind of wonder, like, what, you know, if we don't know what it's like, you kind of don't know what red flags to look for when your country starts to go down these paths. So that's something that struck me when you started mentioning just like kind of like basic essentials that everyone really, like you said, takes for granted. But anyway, so I want to move on to what does it look like to take action? You were in law school. So you were studying government and politics, and you understood kind of the rules of the game. But what did it mean to take action against a regime that, did you have to like call it out for corruption? Like, do you have to be careful with censorship? Like, what would this really look like to you? Well, I can tell you that it is incredibly dangerous to take action in a place like Venezuela. I remember during this first year of me doing activism, this was 2014. This was a big year for protests in Venezuela. We saw millions of people going to the streets to protest and to protest against the dictatorship, basically. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was in this. This was probably my first or second protest that I have ever attended, and I was there with my group of friends from the university. We were part of the same political team from the university, And we decided to just we went to a protest, and we decided that our objectives were fulfilled. We decided to go back to our houses. And then when I returned, a neighbor of mine welcomed me by saying, "Hey, thanks God you arrived. Thanks God you're okay. I saw what's happening on TV. It's horrible." And I was, but what's going on? When I left that the protest, everything was okay, right? When I turned on the TV, everything was on. The streets were on fire. Just a couple of blocks away from where I was standing, another student was shot to death by some Maduro's political thug. Some civilian carrying long weapons started to shoot protesters to defend the revolution or whatever. And he killed a guy who was standing just a couple of blocks in front of me. And, this was probably the most terrifying moment in my entire life as an activist, because I thought that guy could very well have been me, only because I left, I don't know, maybe a few minutes before the thing happened, right? And after that, fear was abundant in all of the members of the movement, because that's when we understood what we were really dealing with. We were dealing with murderers, people who were willing to do anything to control and keep power, keep control, keep.
So you're saying power, they were actually like just regular citizens. They weren't government officials, but they would take extreme action, like gunning someone down to defend the current.
Yeah, exactly. They pretend not to be government officials. The regime hires like civilians to do the dirty job, and because of course, if you use like the police forces or the military to do it, it looks bad on media.
It draws international attention.
If it is someone else, they think that that it looks better, I guess, but it doesn't. I mean, we all know that they all work for the regime, right?
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. And so after the initial protest, after you saw kind of what was in front of you, if you were to keep moving forward, what was your thought process? Like, what were the next steps? How do you even
as I said, as I said, the reason I kept going forward is because I knew that my life was in danger regardless, because I saw what was going on with the food, with the scarcity, and I thought, listen, if we keep following this path, in the future we're going to be starving to death. So I rather rather die, I don't know, fighting for what I believe than go ahead and die because I didn't find anything to eat. It was a really extreme scenario, and we were all full of fear, but regardless, we kept going and going. Later I became the person for my university who was the one dedicated to I don't know how to say it, to put in place like training and find experts to train us in different aspects. For example, I once I brought someone who was expert in communications to help us how to deal with how to encrypt our communications and how to use technology properly, because the regime was always trying to figure out our next moves, in the movement, to know where we're.
So you would bring in so you brought in like kind of guests on campus to speak, but it was under like the guise of an event, but really they were like teaching you guys how to. And so did the government get interested in what was going on your campus, or did they start to suspect anything of?
For sure, because the student movement in Venezuela, we have always, well, I'm no longer a student, but the student movement usually has a great credibility among regular Venezuelans, and people, at least in the past, they used to attend a lot to our demonstrations. Because we were not like part of a political affiliation or anything. We were just students fighting for our right cause, right? And a lot of people saw in the student movement in all of our activities, they saw a way to do activism, and a lot of people joined us. So definitely many of them were interested in what we were doing, right? So as I said, I needed to bring people to help us to how to teach you how to deal with these kind of things, right?
Right.
As I said, communications, or also how to deal with tear bomb gases, and how to give how to help someone who has been, I don't know, shot or has been injured during one of these demonstrations, or what do you do if you find yourself being persecuted by police? Where do you go? I mean, stuff like that. It is completely different to what you see here. Thanks God.
Yeah. So this is something that I find fascinating, because I have thought about it a lot. You know, we talk a lot about our First Amendment rights. In America, we talk about like free speech, freedom of press, and to petition and all of these things. So it's like this concept around freedom of consciousness, religious liberty, and all of these things. But additionally, we often in America talk a lot about the Second Amendment, and we see that Second Amendment as kind of like that line that if it's ever crossed, then it's like we're in a position where we cannot defend ourselves against the government if they were to ever, try to invade our homes or to kind of come into our communities and take over. And so that is an interesting mentality that is unique to Americans specifically because of our history. But what I find interesting about your situation in Venezuela is that once you kind of determined that this regime has to go and that it's starving your people and that this is an existential threat, this is a life or death situation, like where do you even start? Like how do you even organize? Like you said, you have to encrypt your messaging in order to organize properly, but you're just looking at this ginormous behemoth of a problem in front of you. And it's like, how do you even begin to, as a student even, how do you even begin to think about like next steps, put a strategy in place? Like, can you walk us through kind of like, what are some of the things that you guys did? What were your thought processes and like what you were attempting to do here?
Yeah, sure. When we were there, we were always trying to follow, I don't know if you have read this guy, Gene Sharp. He has, he has like a theory that says that you can overthrow these kind of regimes by doing non-violent protests and non-violent activities, and that's what we decided to follow. First of all, because we are just students, we were not able to engage in, I don't know, we were not going to conform a militia or something like that.
Right.
But there were also good examples of how this kind of non-violent protests could actually lead to these kind of regimes to collapse. Right. We were always trying to convince military officers or police members who were doing the dirty job, but were not necessarily being the ones who were receiving the most of the benefits from being part of a tyranny, right? We were always trying to do activities to try to, convince them to switch sides. Mm-hmm. Of course, that didn't work out at the end, but that was always our focus, trying to do peaceful protests to try to bring people from the inside of the regime to our cause and let them, to try to make them see like, hey guys, you are in this ship as well. Your family suffering as much as we are. We need you on our side. Stop following orders. Stop following the command of these people, because this is going to lead us to nowhere. But unfortunately, that really didn't happen at the end. Maduro, he started to feel like he started to hire like people in prison or people or regular criminals, and he gave them like uniforms to do the dirty job. It was a really bad scenario. And he also has a lot of support from foreign regimes like the Russian regime, like the Chinese regime, the Iranians. I mean, all of these people are there giving them supplies, military equipment, even, money sometimes. And it was a really uneven fight at the end. But yeah, that was our focus, trying to do nonviolent protests to try to break the pillars of powers of the regime.
Right. Yeah. And then meanwhile, you're kind of trying to organize these initiatives, but meanwhile, you also have to be very careful, right? To like not you're censoring yourself, making sure that when you're speaking, I assume that when you're walking around and everyone you talk to, you're kind of always looking over your shoulder before you start speaking, or you're kind of just being very careful with who it is that you're interacting with, that you actually can trust them. So can you talk to me a little bit about like just this level of censorship and kind of this overwatch, like people informing on each other and people, trying to constantly catch each other in the act, or the government trying to come in and like spy on you. So what are all of these, what was that environment like? Did these things type of things happen? And generally, was there censorship like in the media, and how everything was covered? And I just like to hear about that side of the story as well.
No, yeah, definitely. It was a really scary scenario because you didn't really know who to trust at the end. For example, I can give you a couple of examples that comes to my mind. In the year 2017, one of my best friends was captured by police because we were. I'm of course a really long story. I'm gonna try to tighten it, but we were in this protest, and he was shot with rubber bullets and all kind of different materials that were being fired by officials in this protest, and he was badly hurt. So we took him to a clinic who was receiving people who was being hurt during the protest, and in this place he met someone who offered him, I don't know, antibiotics and all kind of different supplies. And apparently at the end, this person happened to be someone who was infiltrated, and he was just trying to gather personal information for him. Then this guy made him a phone call, and he said like, "Hey, let's meet up tomorrow, and let's kill some guards, and let's do all these violent things." And my friend was barely listening to the phone call, and at the end, because he said like a couple of words, the phone call was of course a setup, and he appeared on national TV. The phone call appeared on national TV, and he was accused of being a terrorist, and he was basically kidnapped by Maduro's political police, and then needed to disappear. So
wow, you
really, really need to be really careful about who you talk to and who do you trust. And that's actually the reason why we have seen several attempts coming from our own military to try to depose Maduro, but unfortunately the infiltration is so big that all of these attempts have been discovered way before they even happened, and the military prisons are full of good officers that were trying to do the right thing, but they were unable because of spies and infiltration, right? Yeah. Another episode I remember, I am part of a political party in Venezuela named Vente Venezuela. This is a classical liberal political party, and we were having a retreat in some state to learn about the ideology of the party, to read the classical liberal authors like, I don't know, Frederick Bastiat or Hayek or whatever. And we were doing this retreat, and Diosdado Cabello, who is like the second in charge in all of the in the Venezuelan tyranny, he talked about the retreat in his TV program. Yeah, wow. So he knew what we were, and what he said was actually accurate. Like, yeah, these guys are here. They are teaching about I don't know, extreme fascist.
Do you think Do you think there was like a spy in the group, or that?
Yeah, every political organization is going to have to deal with infiltration, right? Or I don't know how they do it, but yeah, there's always going to be someone who is working on their behalf, right?
Wow, yeah. And so, kind of, what was so you kind of understand then that the sense, this self-censorship mentality that we're seeing a lot on college campuses in America now, which is like being very careful what you say, and knowing that retaliation is there's a very high possibility of retaliation based on expressing your ideas and your opinions, especially if they're political ideas or opinions. So let's talk about, kind of like, shift gears to some of the parallels that you're seeing now that you've been in America and kind of talking to students on campuses and witnessing obviously what's going on in the media with all of the protests. First, I guess we can start with, looking at the protests in the United States on campus. There's been a lot of protesters. They tend to turn violent. They tend to destroy property. And you just got done talking about how, you were trying to overthrow a corrupt regime by peacefully protesting. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on what you've seen, the types of protests you've seen. And if you think, what are your general thoughts? Do you think they're productive? Do you think they're effective? Or do you think they're trying to drive fear? I want to get your thoughts on all of that.
Sure. Of course. I don't agree, especially in a country like the U.S., that violence is legit way to produce any kind of change here. If you are upset with any particular policy or any particular decision, I don't believe that violence is legit. First, because we are a democratic society still, right? You can still go to the democratic channels and try to change whatever it is you really want to change, right? Mm-hmm. And second, because after all, I don't believe violence really helping them, that promotes violence. I believe that at the end, if you are seen as a violent and as a radical, the majority of the public is not gonna be in your favor, right? Majority of people are going to just turn against you, and your cause is going to be easily defeated if that's the case. That's also something that we learned, because it wasn't easy. In our case, I believe that we were legitimized to use violence if we wanted to, because we were dealing with a horrible tyranny that was using violence against us. Mm-hmm. But at the end, we didn't even have the means to do so, right? But we also understood that if we were seen as the violent ones, the general public was going to be probably against us, because people always like to side with, I would say, the press. And if you are seen as a provocator, or as someone who is engaging in violence, well, I do believe that you're not going to gain a lot of support from the general audience, right? And I think that's what people are. All of these protesters in campus here in America are missing that part of the equation. And the other thing is that they tend to destroy, property, and, they go to stores and they go to, public facilities that none of the owners of these particular businesses, nor the people that work in these places, have anything to do with the causes they are in theory fighting for, right? So it seems like it seems extremely pointless, in my opinion, to engage in violence, and I hope people really stop doing that here in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because oftentimes when you see what they're protesting, especially on college campuses, we've been seeing a lot of, I was actually just protested not too long ago at a university to go speak on free speech, of all things. That's what I was there to talk about, and it's. There was a lot of students explaining that in their minds, free speech leads to hate speech. And so therefore, free speech can be an evil concept. It can be a negative concept. And they were combating me on the idea that free speech has more good to offer than bad. And so, one thing I talk to a lot of students about is like, look, there's a reason why the Supreme Court in the United States has unanimously, ruled on numerous occasions, even as recently as 2019, that there is no hate speech or offensive speech exception to our First Amendment. And it's because it's something that actually is very difficult to define. It's a subjective term. You can't really define hate, right? How do you it's different to other people. So aside from that, the rational and logic argument about that, what are your thoughts on this idea of hate speech and free speech, this battle between the two? I mean, you come from a country where if you spoke about any of your ideas, you could have been arrested or disappeared. I mean, when we talk about taking things for granted, what are your thoughts on American college students treating free speech?
I think it is extremely dangerous to say that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment, right? Because who actually defines what is hate speech and what not, right? Because maybe right now you are in a position of power and you can say, I like this particular these arguments, I don't like these others, but maybe in the future that you're going to lose your position of power and you're going to see someone else taking that position of power who does not necessarily agree with what you say, and then they're going to say that what you're saying is hate speech and should not be allowed, right? So it is a double sword. I don't know how to say it. It is a mechanism that can easily backfire against you, right? And I hope people understand from all part of people from the left, from the right, whoever, everybody needs to understand that free speech is essential, and everybody should be able to speak whatever they believe in. And if you don't like what people are saying, I think the proper way to fight the argument is by debating, right? By putting in place a better argument and start convincing people that your argument is better than the others people. I think that's the only way to combat hate speech, or because we know that there are a lot of people, speaking really bad things in both sides of the political arena, right? But I don't believe in censorship. I believe it is extremely dangerous. It could be used, maybe today is used to advance whatever cause you believe in, but maybe tomorrow it's going to be used against you, and it shouldn't be that. We should protect, of course, our ability to speak freely.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so a big part of what you do is you do go around to campuses and kind of educate students on your experiences in Venezuela and what not to take for granted. But, what is the role of education in all of this, right? Like this appreciation of one's rights, understanding what censorship looks like when it's happening and the dangers that it leads to. I think a big part of the reason why students talk about how, they take a lot of these rights for granted, or they think that free speech means something that has to do with hate speech, is because it's not really instilled upon us throughout our education, kind of the purpose behind all of this, right? Like the history, like what are the principal foundational concepts of why free speech is such an important issue in America. So I'm curious what your kind of the way you talk to students about this, but what are your thoughts on just the level of education on, all of these things? And especially in Venezuela, I'm actually kind of curious because did you have to confront a lot of citizens who just didn't realize that what was happening was bad? I mean, was there a mass understanding? Everyone realized that the regime was corrupt, or was there a lot of education that had to take place in order for them to really understand what was going on?
Well, I'm going to begin by answering your last question. I would say that when the collapse was so evident, and the big majority of Venezuelans started to suffer because of the collapse and because of the bad decisions coming from the regime, I think that's when it became extremely evident that socialism and these politics that these people were following were really, really a bad idea, right? But at the beginning, it wasn't necessarily the case. Hugo Chavez at the beginning had really had a massive popularity. Well, he really won his first elections. I don't know about the other one because he did a lot of interference with our electoral process. But the first, at least, election he won easily, and he received a lot of support from people who were receiving different kind of social programs or welfare that Chavez created to gain their favors, right? So we really needed to do a huge educational, job to try to convince people in Venezuela that we were following the wrong direction, which is not easy to do, because how do you convince someone? Yeah. If you are receiving, I don't know, some free stuff today, and I tell you, hey, because you are receiving this free stuff, the country is going to collapse in the next years. How do you convince someone who is benefiting in the short term that benefit he is receiving is going to jeopardize our future as a nation? Is something extremely dangerous. Difficult. Yeah. And it was so difficult that even a majority, for not saying all of the political parties in Venezuela, decided not to engage in this kind of rhetoric. They just decided to claim that they were the best socialists. For example, when we used to face Chavez in elections, the opposition parties used to say something like, "If Chavez is giving you this, we're gonna give you the double." That was the kind of the debate.
So that was the counterpoint. The counterpoint,
exactly.
was like, we're going to be more socialist.
Really advocating for free speech or fiscal responsibility or free market. That was never the case, right? And as you said, I believe that education has to play a bigger role if we are going to avoid tragedies like that from happening, because at least that's what we saw in Venezuela. Chavez had it so easy to manipulate people because unfortunately our education system failed to explain to people the importance of republicanism, of how democracy is supposed to operate, why freedom of speech is so important, why it is so important to keep our finances in order, why we cannot spend more than what we gain as a nation, about from what we earn. I mean, stuff like that. Unfortunately, our public education system in Venezuela, it failed dramatically, and that's why it was so easy for someone like Chavez to manipulate the society and lead them in the wrong way, right? Unfortunately, I do believe that some of that is maybe happening here. I see from what I've seen in college campuses, I see a lot of professors that are actively advocating for these really, really bad ideas, proclaiming, fighting for socialism, or saying that, that Marxism is a really good thing or whatever. And a lot of the students are being deceived right now. And that's why I believe it's so important to bring to campus people like me, or people that can't come from other places that experience this kind of doctrines, to teach young kids like, hey, this is the actual consequence of following the ideas that you're being taught in campus, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting because, as you said, the less education, the less knowledge that they're going to have, the less firm grasp they're going to have on some of these really fundamental principles of freedom, that more easily they can be manipulated by faculty and administrators and government officials who are espousing Marxist ideology and some of these critical theories that we talk a lot about on this show. I want to explain a policy to you that we see a lot on college campuses. We did a big study last year on college campuses, looked at over 800 universities, and we found this policy. And I want to describe the policy to you, and then I want to get your immediate reaction to it. So they're called bias reporting systems. And what they are is they are anonymous reporting systems where the school solicits reports from students on one another and faculty for anything that's considered a bias incident. And bias can be defined by the university however it wants. Oftentimes they will say hate, bias, offensive speech, unwanted, joking, stereotyping, microaggressions, that kind of, just generally anyone who has like something to say that people don't like. And then again, to reiterate, these are anonymous reporting systems, right? So I want to get your thoughts on that. Now, we found that 54% of the universities that we looked at, private and public, have these anonymous reporting systems on their campuses. And you can report an incident that occurs anytime, anywhere, in any place, on or off campus, that includes social media. So what's your hot take on that?
Wow, it sounds scary, definitely. Of course, in Venezuela, I think we have something similar, the regime is always encouraging neighbors and people in your community to try to, to inform regime officials about any potential person who is maybe speaking against the regime, or organizing some sort of political protest or whatever. So, and they reward this kind of behavior. So, again, I think that drives me back again to my time in campus, when, because of politics like this, or it was really, really hard to find who to trust, and it is definitely scary. Of course, in a minor level, I would say, because in Venezuela we were talking about. The consequence was probably you were going to prison, or you were not receiving medicines from certain regime programs or stuff like that. I guess the consequence, of course, here is less. But I think at the end, the spirit is the same, right? Is to try. Yeah. They're trying. It seems like they're trying to bully their way out of, and to avoid any kind of political discourse that they are not aligned with. I guess, right? And yeah, it sounds scary. And sometimes, my vision of America is, the land of the free, is like the land where you can speak whatever you want, and you're not going to suffer consequence from the authority. But the fact that campuses are doing stuff like this it's actually scary. And
it's scary, and it's bleeding off campus too. I mean, we've seen, I think New York City has a bias reporting system now. And I think Portland, Oregon also has one. So it's starting. And this is what's so fascinating, because you said your first reaction to that was like, oh, this sounds really similar to something that was happening in Venezuela, which is like a corrupt socialist regime that's trying
even worse in Cuba. I think Cuba is even worse.
Exactly. And these tactics are not new, right?
This looks like a tactic coming from a totalitarian regime, right?
And they're not new. There's something that these types of tactics have been used ever since any kind of totalitarian. I mean, we talk about the Stasi in East Germany. You could talk about the Red Scare. There's all sorts of incidents where you can kind of trace this. It's happening right now, probably in China. I mean, where the government wants that informant system set up, not only to reward the informants, but mostly to tamp down on dissenters and to create this environment essentially of censorship, where even if people disagree with the government, they're never going to speak up, right? Because that's really ultimately what is, in my opinion, trying to be had on campuses, where, it's all just going to be one kind of political agenda on college campuses, one ideological dogma, and anyone who wants to push back is going to be reported. And, I've been on campuses where I see signs in all the classrooms that say, see something, say something. And they're not talking about terrorist activity with backpacks being left alone like it used to be, like on, after 9/11. They're talking about if you see someone or hear someone essentially say something that is like a bad idea or an offensive idea, that you need to report it. And those types of signs in the classroom, you're kind of like, wow, what does that do for discussion? So I'm kind of curious, what was your experience, when dealing with where you had this regime that it was guaranteed that if you spoke up publicly, you would have a target on your back. What kind of conversations were being had in the classrooms? What kind of political conversations? Was everyone, you might have secretly been plotting against the government or planning protests, but publicly, what was the discourse like? Was it all just like one idea that everyone was talking about, socialism?
Well, thanks God, I had the blessing of attending a private university in Venezuela, right? And this was a Jesuit campus. And I think that was probably inside this campus was the only place where we felt relatively free to speak against the regime, or to engage in conversation about the reality of Venezuela and stuff like that. Because professors were not encouraging us to not do it, or the leadership of the university was in our favor, right? They were trying to help us time to time. It probably is not the same. However, you were always had to fear from people coming from the outside, or students that probably were bought by the regime. That's true. But yeah, I do believe that this kind of politics that we're seeing in campus in the U.S., that really reminds me of things that we saw not necessarily on campus in my in Venezuela, at least not in my university, but in my community. In my neighborhood. That was a real thing. That when a neighbor maybe suspected that you were part of some sort of political organization, and if they were in favor of the regime, if they were receiving a benefit, they were most likely going to to accuse you, and then you were going to see consequences, right? So yeah, it is a really, really sad and a scary situation to deal with, and I dealt with that in Venezuela. And I think the way we tried to fight back was by uniting as much people as possible that believe in our same values, and speaking as a group. I think that gave us a little bit more strength to deal with people like that, right? But and I hope people here in campus do the same, right? I think conservative students or people who don't necessarily agree with whatever policies being enacted on campus, I think it is really easy for campuses to step on you. If you are just a single person, you're going to suffer a lot of consequences. But if you are a big group, well, maybe it's difficult for the campus to do this kind of actions, right? So I don't know if that answers your.
Yeah, no, it does. Moving forward, for students who do want to, there are a lot of students, for all those who demonize free speech and take their freedoms for granted, there are also a good number of students who do want to fight to keep their freedoms and want to speak up and, fight the censorship on campus. So what is your advice to the students who want to speak up more or who want to be kind of a part of the fight to defend their freedoms and not take them for granted? What do you see moving forward? What are some positive lights going forward in the United States that you think that shows signs of hope? But also, what are some dangers, some precarious paths that you see other students going down that you would warn against to prevent us from going on a similar path to Venezuela?
Well, I would say I do believe that there is a lot of signs of hope, as you said, for the U.S. Because, as I said, for example, when Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez, nobody important was doing the job of making the argument for, I don't know, free speech or private property rights or fiscal conservatism. All of those things were almost forgotten, and everybody was one way or another on board with the socialist ideas, right? And I don't think that's the case here in the U.S. I see great political organizations and student organizations that are doing a really amazing job trying to speak up against these things and try to bring to the table another perspective for students to see, right? For example, I don't know, Turning Point USA or Young Americans Foundation or Young Americans for Liberty. I mean, all of these great organizations that are actively working on campus trying to convince the students that there is a better way to do things. To be honest, I barely see stuff like that happening in Venezuela, especially during our early years dealing with socialism, right? So I believe that there are a lot of people here, good people working on behalf of freedom, and that's something that unfortunately we didn't have at the beginning, right? And yeah, my advice would be, even though of course the conditions that I faced when I wasn't a student in Venezuela were completely different from what you're facing right now. I mean, of course, you are dealing with censorship and all kind of stuff, but in Venezuela we were dealing with monsters, people, right? Like were willing to even kill us or put us in prison just for saying the wrong thing. It's not, of course, it's never going to be the same. I hope it's never the same. But I would say, as I said at the beginning, if you really want to speak out, our strength is in the numbers, right? If you have to find people that think like you and start organizing in groups, and that's going to be, I think, when you are a large number of people, that's make it easier for you to speak as a group. You find a strength in the number, right? I would say, right. Because if you are all alone, it's going to be really easy for all of these university leaders to step on you and try to silence you. But if you are a big group, well, it's going to be a little bit harder, I guess. So
yeah, finding those avenues to amplify your voice. Yeah, absolutely. Writing stuff too, publishing your ideas and thoughts. But yeah, I think if it comes down to, look, a lot of this does come down to courage, right? Because I think kind of what you were emphasizing earlier is a big part of the reason why socialism so easily overtook Venezuelans, and there were so many who were supporting it, was just this mentality of complacency, and that everyone was just kind of okay with the way things were going. No one was challenging, no one was pushing back to the extent that we're seeing here. So maintaining that courage here, trying to recruit more people to feel that way. A lot of students that I talk to are fearful of retaliation for speaking up. They're afraid their reputations will be destroyed. They might get kicked out of school. But I think really what it is, like you said, it has to be numbers. So you have these clubs and these organizations that exist, finding those allies on campus, finding faculty members and administrators who also agree with you, just like you did when you were down in Venezuela. Finding those allies on campus is huge. And it's really a matter of, identifying, finding the people who think the way that you do. Well, thank you so much. Is there any final thoughts that you want to leave us with? Any things that... No, hopefully not too many like foreboding things about the United States going too far down the path of Venezuela. But if you want to say any final words.
No, just encourage everybody just to keep fighting for freedom and for liberty. I think what you have here in the U.S. is beautiful. I have been in the States for a little bit more than 4 years, and I love it here. You know, I don't really want to go through the same all over again, right? And
So, don't ruin America for me.
Exactly. Keep fighting for freedom. What you have here is nice. It's not perfect, but we can always improve. But for sure, socialism is not the way to improve things here.
Absolutely not.
Thank you so much, Cherise.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Cherise Trump, and Jorge, that was well said.